government committed so many atrocities across the world. So many Muslims were murdered or displaced because of U.S. wars and bombs. They committed genocide towards indigenous people, and there are now still systematic discrimination towards people of color in the United States. Yet they are still considered as the beacon of democracy, the beacon of human rights defender. They must have a really powerful propaganda skill to be like me when you are the perpetrator, being seen as deemed, be described as the protector, defender of human rights. So how is that possible?
There's an assumption that when the West acts, it acts to uphold high values. So for instance, when the West goes into wars, it's about human rights, it's about, promoting democracy and so on. The West doesn't go into wars to commit war crimes. And we know this. We know that this sensibility exists, Jingjing, because after the NATO bombing of Libya, many of us sent letters to NATO asking NATO for clarification about the nature of the bombing. Well, NATO doesn't have to respond to a journalist from India. I understand that. But the United Nations also asked NATO, and so did Human Rights Watch. And NATO's lead lawyer, Peter Olsen, wrote them back on the record, saying essentially, he said the following. He said that, look, I'm glad you're doing an investigation of inadequacies in war. Let's not call them war crimes, whatever. But he wanted to be clear. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, never commits war crimes. Never. That's it. So we don't need to investigate us. We never commit war crimes. That's an interesting attitude. How do you know that? I mean, particularly given that at the same time as this was occurring, people were going through the State Department cables and the Pentagon materials released by Chelsea Manning through the WikiLeaks organization, and there was direct evidence of war crimes in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Okay, we didn't have direct war crimes from the WikiLeaks cables on Libya, but we had NATO war crimes in Afghanistan. We knew that the Swedish government decided to enter the NATO campaign so they could test weapon systems in Afghanistan. All of that through Chelsea Manning's, revelations, of the State Department and Pentagon materials. But they still have this huge feeling that the West only acts, the West enters wars to bring good, never for some bad purpose. And the reverse of that is the adversaries of the West are always savages. You see, that's the colonial mindset, that the West goes into the colony to civilize people. When the colonial rises up and fights back, they are being savages. This goes back to the way Western reporters wrote about, Khartoum, the Battle of Khartoum in 1884. They wrote about the Boxer Rebellion in this way. Every time the Chinese resisted the Opium Wars and so on, the Chinese were treated as savages in the media. Like, how dare you fight? And if you fight brutally. When the Indians rose up in 1857, in the Great Indian Uprising of 1857 against British rule, every British newspaper said these are savages. They conduct atrocities. After that war ended, Indians who were caught by the British were strapped to cannons, and the cannons were fired as a warning to others not to fight. I mean, it's a brutal repression of people. And yet that doesn't change the impression of the West as aggressive. The West is always doing things for human rights, and the savages are always wrong. Now, until we're able to convince our international fraternity of journalists not to adopt these kind of colonial and racist ideas, to ask basic questions, look, the United States killed, a million people in Iraq in an illegal war. You don't call that genocide, but meanwhile, you're adopting, a US State Department designation to talk about Xinjiang. How do you get that? We have evidence of over 1 million Iraqis killed because of the US war. You never use the word genocide there. And frankly, I don't think the word genocide is useful for that. Genocide has a particular meaning. The attempt to eradicate a people. what evidence is there in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of anything like genocide? And yet they use the terminology because they believe in the end that the State Department doesn't lie to them. And I think that's astounding after all these experiences of the lies that led people into the Iraq war, the lies over the Libya war, the ridiculous lies through the 20 years of this occupation of Afghanistan. You'd expect sensible journalists to say, hey, listen, let me just look and see what's going on here. No, you don't have that. Instead, what you have is you have people just repeating, like ventriloquist dummies, when you have a little ventriloquist dummy and you're saying, hello, my name is, here's the State Department. Here's Mike Pompeo, who was the head of the CIA, which conducted the torture of Muslims in Guantanamo and black sites all over the world. Mike Pompeo is saying, I'm the defender of Muslims in China, and the media just puppets Mike Pompeo. I mean, they don't ask the question, who is speaking, to what end, and is there any legitimacy to what he is saying? And also, is there any truth to what he's saying? And how do I establish that? There's no investigation. Lastly, some years ago, a journalist who covered North Korea for many years said, the thing about covering North Korea, the DPRK, the thing about covering that country is that you can say anything about it and the paper will print it. You can say last year 50,000 dogs were killed in North Korea and it'll be the front page of the New York Times. You don't have to have two sources. You don't have to have external validification. You don't have to have any of this. Whatever you say about that country, they'll print it. And I'm afraid the situation is like that now with China, that anything a journalist wants to say about China will get printed. And that's concerning, I think, for journalists. It's concerning for the truth.